Welcome back, everyone. I am Cas Piancey. I'm joined as usual by my partner in crime, Mr. Bennett Tomlin. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Cas?
I'm doing good. Today, Bennett and I are talking about CZ, who was the CEO and founder of Binance, the most liquid and voluminous cryptocurrency exchange in the world. I think still, right?
Yes, by far.
Which is kind of crazy because of the things we're going to talk about today. But the difference between what happened to him, he just got tried and sentenced for what he did at Binance. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the difference between that and what happened to SBF and what SBF was guilty of and why he ended up getting a much longer sentence. SBF, of course, being Sam Bankman-Fried, who was the CEO and founder of another cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, and a trading firm called Alameda Research. But yeah, sorry for the long-winded explanation there. But Bennett, do you want to just kind of describe what happened to CZ, what he is guilty of?
CZ was actually not tried. He pleaded guilty to violations of the Bank Secrecy Act and was sentenced to 4 months in prison. And for some people, this has been a jarring comparison to the recent trial conviction and sentencing of Sam Bankman-Fried. For those who missed our many previous episodes on the topic, Sam Bankman-Fried was convicted of 7 felony accounts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit a variety of different types of fraud, securities fraud, commodities fraud, just about any kind of fraud he could get his hands on. And Sam Bankman-Fried was sentenced to 25 years in prison, which is 75 times more than 4 months. And some people don't feel that there's a 75-fold difference in what these two people were doing. That's kind of what we're looking at today. What led to this drastic difference between these two criminals and the time they'll spend repaying their debt to society?
I think it's worth pointing out, as far as we know, there's no confirmation of this, but as far as we know, especially considering that Sam Bankman-Fried is still putting in appeals and trying to alter his sentence. And yeah, he's desperately trying to get out of what has happened. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that anything is possible. We're seeing that with like Harvey Weinstein right now, unfortunately. You never know when an appeal, as unlikely as it may seem, is going to work. So we don't know what will happen with Sam Bankman-Fried. What we can say for sure is that he was sentenced to 25 years. He had already done over a year in prison by the time he was sentenced to that. So that time is counted, or time in jail, sorry. So that time is counted. We also believe that he will be eligible for a program that will get him, likely, if he behaves himself in federal prison, out after serving roughly 50% of his sentence. So something like 11, 12 years.
Which is still a long time, especially if you spend a lot of it at MDC because you're desperately appealing.
Sure. That's wild. But I will say that it is a very long time. I do understand why people would prefer if there was kind of an exemption, considering how many people he hurt, because SBF, through his malfeasance, did hurt a lot of people. Can you just let's talk about that, because that's really the heart of why he was given such a strong sentence, along with his lack of remorse and cooperation. So let's discuss all of that.
Yeah, and I think this gets at the bulk of why their sentences are so different. And we'll get into the cooperation and general ability to handle a crisis, which also contributed. But like, Sam Bankman-Fried embezzled somewhere in the range from $8 to $11 billion in assets from FTX, leaving it massively insolvent, and therefore meaning that like the entire thing just collapsed. As far as we know, Binance never had an $8 to $11 billion hole in its books, and none of the criminal charges brought against Changpeng Zhao are about having a hole in the books. They're primarily about Binance's deliberate choice to not maintain a compliance program in order to increase their volume and things like that. Having said that, I do want to note that we've discussed on here before that Binance accounting has problems that suggests at times they may have been double counting certain assets and other things that suggest there may have been some problems but they were never on the scale of 8 to 11 billion, and they never caused the exchange to shut down withdrawals and collapse into bankruptcy. And that's the real kicker here, right? Is that regardless of whatever else CZ was doing, Binance did not collapse into a messy bankruptcy, hurting like tons and tons of people.
And now I want to get into something because yes, that's all of that is, as far as we know, that's accurate. I mean, we have no, like you said, we don't know what the books actually look like for Binance. Very few people would, but I think
even the CFO, if you remember our one episode from when I was out visiting you.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of what I was hoping we could bring up, is this idea that we've been talking about Binance and the problems and the solutions and all of this going on for over a year now. This is not new that CZ and Binance were under investigation and in trouble. A big difference here, though, is they apparently, as far as we can tell, immediately cooperated with the government and opened up the cryptocurrency exchange to the feds, for lack of a better way of phrasing this. And, you don't have to take my word for it. Look at the agreements that have been made.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. And like the other thing that just keeps running through my head, like in the lead up to the sentencing and after the sentencing, has been comparisons to Arthur Hayes. For those who don't remember, Arthur Hayes was the founder and once the chief executive officer of BitMEX, an offshore cryptocurrency exchange that allowed people to make massive leverage bets on Bitcoin. Eventually, Arthur Hayes became worried, convinced that there was potential criminal charges waiting in the wings for him, hired a top-flight law firm to start dealing with some of those consequences, placed himself in a non-extradition location while they were working on whatever they could work, and then eventually surrendered at a time basically of his choosing to the feds, pleaded to, I think, one count of violating the Bank Secrecy Act, and his sentencing was, I think, just house arrest for Arthur Hayes after that negotiation. And Changpeng Zhao apparently saw Arthur Hayes do that and was like, oh, that's the trick. That's what I'm going to have to do. And so back in 2022-ish, 2021-ish, when the regulatory and law enforcement pressure on Binance started stepping up, Binance did a few things. They started hiring like Tigran Gambrayan from the IRS and a bunch of other people to lead like their new unit that was going to be cooperating with authorities around the world to make Binance useful for them. And Changpeng Zhao himself hired Kendall Day, the former head of the Department of Justice's Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Service, to start negotiating on his behalf in Washington. So Binance starts cooperating as fully as possible. Changpeng Zhao hires arguably the best possible lawyer for this type of thing to start negotiating on his behalf and places himself in a non-extradition country until the deal's been negotiated and he's ready to surrender. And this is just such a strong contrast to Sam Bankman-Fried, who, when he realized there was a problem, went running in, not to the feds, not to lawyers, not to accountants, but to Changpeng Zhao, and then collapsed into bankruptcy.
And then just started loudly and publicly protesting his innocence, which CZ has been very, very careful in regards to his public relations ever since then. CZ was always less obnoxious than Sam Bankman-Fried.
And this continued like even through their literal sentencing. Sam Bankman-Fried, his letter to the judge before his sentencing, half of it is Macklemore lyrics. Part of it, he describes how much he's going to miss having sex. Like, the entire thing is a mess in which he never, like, actually expresses regret or sorrow. And Changpeng Zhao, when he was in court for his sentencing, was like, I'm sorry for what I did and the harms I've caused. I take responsibility. I was the CEO and this is all my responsibility. And so even at the end, even when like the hands were basically dealt, the chips were going to land where they were, there was still such a striking difference between how these two adult cryptocurrency executives faced the music as it was coming. And part of that might come to the difference in the music. Changpeng Zhao knew he was very unlikely to get over 18 months, as we've talked about before. But like, it's still striking to see that repeated to the very bitter end.
Well, I think it really tells you a lot about both of these individuals as well, where you have Sam Bankman-Fried, who seems to always think he knows what's best, regardless of the experts around him. and then CZ, who is doing everything to shut his mouth and hire people who he knows understand everything better than he does. And he's just there to listen.
And like the other takeaway is following Changpeng Zhao's pattern, following Arthur Hayes' pattern here, you can get away with a lot if you cooperate and play it well, right? Like Binance was the largest or second largest counterparty for Hydra. They were transacting with some of these sanctioned Iranian entities and things like that. Like there was a lot of seriously questionable transactions, like problematic bookkeeping, wash trading, and arguably market manipulation, conflicted transactions between trading firms and exchange. There's a lot to still dig into in the Binance story. But like fundamentally, because he saw that there was the power of the state coming towards him, most of that never came up.
I think it's worth pointing out that they also paid, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I believe Binance paid the largest fine in history, $4 billion. If not the largest, one of the largest settlements in history, $4 billion, which I guess they're able to pay without touching customer deposits and all of that stuff, because they also have court-appointed people within the inside of Binance essentially ensuring that everything is as they claim it is.
Well, and you talked about that $4 billion fine, and like we've complained about the HSBC case on this podcast before, and this was double the monetary amount of that case, right? And so if you're living in a world, which unfortunately we are, where cases like the HSBC case are how the system works, regrettably, then Binance's case stops seeming like the whiff it sometimes feels like, because they literally got a fine double the size of HSBC, this massive bank, right?
I definitely understand the disappointment in the concept of fining any of these entities at all, right? I totally understand that sentiment. I get it. If you're going to have these laws in place about, helping terrorists get funded, where I would expect the US government would come down incredibly hard on a singular individual who is guilty of any of this stuff, but didn't come down as hard on the entity of Binance and the individual of CZ. I get the frustration with that. I do want to point out, you and I were discussing this, that those funds don't go directly to the SEC. Those funds don't go directly to the Department of Justice. Those funds are given to the general fund. Those are general fund funds. They go back to the Treasury. Like ultimately, it looks great for them when they go ask for their budget next year in front of Congress, but it is not strictly speaking like, oh, they're getting a payoff. They're getting this big fine. It's all going straight to them. That's why they're accepting it. That is not how it works. I want to make sure people are cognizant of that. I still get the frustration. However, we don't have to like it. We don't have to agree with it. In fact, I think probably it's not just no coiners. I'm sure there's a lot of coiners out there who really didn't appreciate the way that CZ did business either. You don't have to like the guy to understand why the US government is doing what it's doing and making the deals that seem like sweetheart deals. I do get the idea that if you're able to get within the business structure of the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, how that can pay off in other ways, I guess.
And I think what you just mentioned there with the monitor is like a significant motivator for government investigators. We've talked before about like how the Alphabet seizure led to like eventually all the Hydra convictions, Razzle-Khan and Dutch's cases. All this stuff came because the government got access to this relatively small, compared to something like Binance, site that helped them piece together a bunch of the other actors in the ecosystem. And the number of actors in the ecosystem who have zero interaction with Binance is very, very small. And so having this additional level of insight was definitely, in my opinion, a motivator for government investigators.
I totally agree with that. I don't think either of us necessarily approves of the way these things go, we're certainly not cheerleaders for CZ or Binance. I mean, I think it's incredible that BNB hasn't gotten them in huge trouble from a long time ago.
The SEC case is still going on.
Well, we'll see what happens with that.
You know the SEC, they always go for the throat.
Gosh, we'll have to do an episode about that, just seeing, it's been pretty interesting to see how people are getting really upset that the SEC are sending out a bunch of Wells notices now. You should like and subscribe. Otherwise, the price of Cascoin is just going to keep going down. I don't know what else to tell you guys.
Merritt Pete can't keep buying Cas coin at these prices. You gotta stop them.